welcome back to The World Over. He has already written 2 magisterial biographies of St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope and The End and the Beginning. But my next guest believed there was more to tell. Tonight, George Weigel joins us to discuss his new memoir, which touches on his friendship with the late, now sainted Pope. It's called Lessons in Hope, My Unexpected Life with St. John Paul II. I sat down with him recently here in our D.C. studio. Here's my exclusive interview with George Weigel. George, I want to start with the new book, Lessons in Hope. You say here this is the defining personality of your life, John Paul II. How so?
Well, certainly the defining personality of my professional life. And I say that, Raymond, because as I explain in the book, the 15 years I spent writing 2 volumes of biography of John Paul II helped me read backwards through my own life in an entirely different way. Things that seemed random at the time, what I had studied in college, what I had done professionally.
You go back to the 3rd grade in Baltimore.
Well, that's right, praying for communist dictators in Poland in Lent in 1960. All of this begins to come into focus as providential preparation for taking on this job. And that reflects that thing we all learned from John Paul II, when he said at Fatima, a year after the assassination attempt, in the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences. What we think is coincidence or happenstance is simply some facet of providence that hasn't fallen into place in our self-understanding yet. So the book is built around that theme, and I hope that provides an interesting framework.
George, you have written 2 magisterial works on John Paul that are really, there's not a bookshelf I go to in most places that don't have a copy of one, if not both of your volumes there. What, given all of that, don't we know about this man that you reveal here?
Well, this book began in my mind when I was out talking about the 2nd volume, The End and the Beginning, which has a lot of interesting stuff that I remember we talked about from old communist secret police files, all sorts of new information. And I discovered that what people really wanted was not analysis. People wanted stories. This was 5 years after his death. People wanted stories that brought him back, made him seem a bit closer.
Right.
So I reflected on that for several years and then decided, all right, that's an honorable request, so to speak. Give us some stories. So I now think of this book as the 3rd panel of a kind of triptych. You know, Witness to Hope, The End and the Beginning, and now Lessons in Hope. And I think this fills out some of the human dimensions of John Paul II, some of the off-stage, if you will, dimensions of his life that would not have really fit terribly well in 2 volumes of scholarly biography. The other thing this allows me to do at considerably greater length is to introduce this remarkable cast of characters around him in greater depth.
And you do, and you go, and look, you've got Cardinal Rilko, you've got Casaroli, you've got Polish theologians, Navarro Valls. What I found odd in the middle of the book, as you go through and you have chapters dedicated to each of the people I just mentioned, it's like you're circling John Paul. Why don't you let us land on him in those chapters?
Well, I think you're visiting him in virtually every part of the book, but at certain points, you need to back up and understand the surround better so that you can understand this man better. I mean, a perfect example would be this astonishing woman, Irina Alberti, Russian emigre, his secret agent in the old Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn's former secretary. To lay out her story and her work with him And then to hear her talk about him is to meet him through a wholly different prism.
What was the most illuminating thing she told you about Karol Wojtyła?
She confirmed for me his extraordinary respect for Russian Orthodox spirituality and 20th century Russian Orthodox theology, and particularly a figure that most Americans don't know much about, named Vladimir Soloviev, who was a kind of a prophet of the ecumenical movement. And she also helped me understand why it was so frustrating for him to be constantly blocked by the present leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, or the leadership at his time, from getting to Russia. And at one point, I report a conversation with the Pope, and we were discussing this, and he said, they're not so easy to deal with. I think that's something new that would not have fit in Witness to Hope or The End and the Beginning, but it's very much part of the picture.
Our friend, Father Richard John Newhouse, really was at the genesis of this whole journey for you. And I love the line where he tells you, this is going to change your entire life, George.
Well, that was Richard. I mean, as I say, in that slightly exaggerated way.
Dramatic way.
Which was part of his charm. He was certainly right, Raymond, in that I didn't go back to the kind of life I had been leading here in Washington at the Ethics and Public Policy Center before. I mean, my work on, in, and for the church became much more central to my professional life. That's fine. I'm happy to be able to do that, and I hope I've been able to make some modest contribution to that. The other thing, of course, is this business of seeing what came before in a different focus. I hadn't thought about Lent in the third grade in Baltimore in 1960 for a long time. But you now cannot tell me that praying for the communist dictator of Poland when I was 8 years old or 9 years old or whatever I was then did not plant some sort of a seed.
Have a connection to what would follow.
That bore fruit much later.
Now, most of your conversations with John Paul are over dinners.
Yes. Lunch and dinner.
How many did you have, if you had to guess?
I never counted them up, a couple of dozen, certainly.
What was the most interesting and revealing? And there are many you mentioned in the book, one particular I want to talk about, but to your mind, as far as you saw something, and when you're one-on-one with someone, particularly over dinner, they relax, and you see a part of them that you don't always get to see. What did you see there that changed or altered or deepened your understanding of him?
I think the most memorable meeting in some respects was actually the last, and I think it was December 15th, 2004. My father had died 2 months before. The Pope was aware of this, in fact had sent a telegram to be read at the funeral. But he was in pretty tough shape at that point himself. So I walked into the dining room. He had already been seated at the table. And the first thing he said was, "How is your mother doing?" I mean, that remarkable pastor's memory, when he's got all sorts of problems of his own, what was truly astonishing.
You mentioned in the book a particular dinner in January of 1997, where John Paul reflects on his memories of World War II, and he talks about a humiliation at the hands of evil. And the really profound commitment to human dignity that would come out of that understanding. That told you what when he mentioned that line?
People often ask me, what did you learn about him that you didn't know before in all of this stuff? And I say, look, the two large things that I learned were, first, that his father was the absolutely formative influence of his young life. And secondly, that the Second World War, the experience of the Second World War, what he called humiliation at the hands of evil during that dinner you referenced, was the formative experience of his early adult life, I think that's what bent his vocational discernment toward the priesthood, and that is what certainly ignited in him a determination to be a defender of human rights through the priesthood of the Catholic Church.
What do you make of reports we're seeing now? We're moving into the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae. There are reports that Pope Francis has appointed a commission to study it, and some indication that there may be a reappraisal in the wind. John Paul was such a defender of that particular encyclical, and he advanced, I would argue, the teaching and really updated it, putting it in the context of our current time. Are you concerned that we might diminish or forget the legacy of that teaching, John Paul's?
No, I'm not, because the living parts of the church have embraced it. The parts of the church that are doing best by marriage preparation, by family counseling, by education of young people and their capacity for human love have all embraced the theology of the body, which was John Paul II's attempt to get the truth taught in Humanae Vitae into a more understandable contemporary frame of reference. And that lives throughout the world church. And I think it's a shame that some people don't seem to recognize that and are still scratching itches from the past.
From the 70s and 60s,
But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the living parts of the world church, in the developed world, in the developing world, wherever you go, it is those parts of the church that have embraced what I have come to call all-in Catholicism and are living the new evangelization. And it's those parts of the church that are still thrashing around in the shallow waters of Catholic light that are frankly dying. And that is the problem in Europe. That's the problem that came into the surface when we were together in Rome during the recent synods. And I think it's a huge problem for the church of the future.
You brought up those synods, and were you shocked? And I've gotten letters, I almost get them every day, emails and letters from people saying, why do we seemingly ignore the teachings of John Paul II? They're referring to his Constitution on the Family, which were so comprehensive, yet at the Synod, George, they were barely invoked. In fact, some, even in the inner circle of the Pope, has said, you know, it's time to put those in context or update them for a new age.
Well, I think it was a great misfortune that the extraordinarily talented and wise people of the John Paul II Institute for the Study of Marriage and the Family were systematically excluded from the synods of 2014 and 2015. If this pattern repeats itself at the Synod of 2018, where, for example, if Curtis Martin, founder of Focus, is not invited to that synod, something is deeply wrong. If those running successful campus ministries throughout the United States are not invited to that synod, something is wrong. And I think the bishops of the world need to address that.
I want to ask you finally about all these materials, and I can only imagine what your attics and closets look like. I read a piece recently where you said you're donating a lot of those papers, your research, which I imagine, how much do you think you have? Well, you must know.
It's a lot of stuff. And all of my professional papers from this project and other projects are going to go to the Library of Congress, where they will be available to people interested in serious research. I'm also donating to the library. I'm going to get these digitized, I hope, later this year. All of the interview tapes from Witness to Hope and The End and the Beginning.
Wow.
Which include, among other things, 12 hours of conversation with Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI. So there's a lot of material there for people to work with. And I thought that was the appropriate place to put it. These people really know how to deal with a lot of
They do.
stuff.
Voluminous materials of different types.
And that'll be there sooner rather than later.
Lesson in hope. What's the lesson in hope that you hope people take from this work?
The lessons in hope is the summation of what I learned from John Paul II. Never give in to the tyranny of the possible. The idea that things simply are the way they are, you can't change it, you can't fix it, the Berlin Wall's always going to be there.
Right.
Kids are never going to be interested in the Catholic Church, you can't make the Church's teaching on human love make sense. Actually, you can.
Right.
You can do all this stuff. But it requires faith, it requires courage, it requires grit, and it requires intelligence.
And creativity, which you point out. There's that conversation, and you explicate it in this book, the conversation where he sort of unveiled to you his thinking during the resistance in Poland and the countercultural ways he wanted to rebuild and reseed that culture. Before we go, give people insight into that mind and soul.
Well, he understood that resistance to the Nazi occupation of Poland was not restricted to stealing machine guns and spraying bullets around.
Right.
If the occupier's intention was to decapitate the country by killing its culture
and
then
intelligentsia,
what you do is keep that culture alive, deepen it, give it an even more firm spiritual foundation, and build out from there. This, of course, is a huge lesson for us today. If we've got problems in our political culture in the United States, that may be because we have serious problems with our public moral culture, and that needs
remedy,
a new great awakening.
George Weigel, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Raymond.
Lessons in Hope, My Unexpected Life with St. John Paul II by George Weigel is available now at bookstores everywhere, online, and through EWTN's Religious Catalog.